Ever feel like everyone's pushing these get-rich-quick schemes in the business world? Like, just do these 3 things and boom, you're the next big thing.
Right.
Today, we're really diving deep into Aswath Damodaran's book, the New Corporate Life Cycle one.
And New W, the corporate life cycle, yeah.
To see why that kind of thinking, it can really backfire.
Yeah.
And how knowing how businesses really grow and change, well, it can make you a better investor or just, someone who's more in the know.
What I find fascinating about Damodaran is he ditches the one-size-fits-all approach. Like, take Markovitz's efficient portfolio theory. It tries to, find the perfect balance between risk and return, but it's all very static,
Right.
And Damodaran argues that clinging to that can actually make you miss real opportunities. And risks, too, because the market is anything but static.
It's like trying to predict the weather using just one day from last year. You need a more, what's the word, like a more complex model?
Precisely. And that's where Damodaran brings in not just the hard numbers, the finance stuff, but the psychology of it all. How do people actually behave in markets? He draws on people like Kahneman and Tversky.
Oh, right, the behavioral economics guys.
Exactly. They showed that we make decisions often based on, irrational biases.
Like, we're more afraid of losing money than we are excited about gaining it.
Exactly. Loss aversion, or how, the way information is presented to us, it can totally change our choices, even if the underlying facts are the same.
So it's not just about how businesses work, but how our brains work when it comes to business. We're predictably irrational.
Exactly. Now, apply that to something as unpredictable as a startup. In Damodaran, he doesn't sugarcoat it. He straight up says failure rates, especially in sectors like tech, information technology, and construction,
Or risky ones.
can be above 80%.
80%. So, most startups fail.
It's a reality check for sure.
What are the biggest, pitfalls that lead to those kinds of numbers?
Funding, of course, is huge. You're always burning cash, right? Trying to perfect your product, convince investors you're not just another statistic. But what Damodaran really digs into is how, even when startups get funding, there's often a catch. He's got all these real-world examples of founders who, they go through multiple rounds of venture capital.
Right, trying to get to the next level.
And they end up giving away big chunks of their ownership. It's this question of, control versus potential.
That's got to be tough. Those founders, they're visionaries, used to calling the shots. Could you even keep control and still grow big? Or is that just the trade-off?
It's a tightrope walk. No easy answer there. But let's say you're one of the lucky ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
You beat the odds and hit this crazy, exciting phase of rapid growth. Damodaran calls it young growth.
Okay, young growth.
And that's really interesting. Think Amazon, Netflix back in the day. Their revenue was exploding 20%, 30% growth year after year.
I can't even imagine. That's incredible. But the pressure to keep that up, at what point does growing that fast become more of a problem than, a good thing?
That is the million-dollar question. And that's where understanding these different stages, these life cycles that Damodaran talks about, it becomes so crucial. He argues that what works for a small, nimble startup could be a disaster for a huge company. Being able to adapt quickly, pivot, that gets a lot harder when you have thousands of employees, complex supply chains, and of course, public markets breathing down your neck.
It's like you go from driving a speedboat to steering a giant cargo ship.
Exactly.
So how do you keep from crashing that cargo ship into an iceberg of, unsustainable growth?
Well, Damodaran, he has this framework. He calls it the 3P test. It's pretty simple, but really powerful when you're trying to figure out if a business model can go the distance.
Okay, now that sounds useful. Break it down for us. What's the 3P test?
So you got to ask yourself 3 questions. First, possible. Is this even doable in the real world? Or am I chasing some fantasy that just doesn't exist?
No perpetual motion machines or businesses based on, selling people, grass clippings as delicacy.
Exactly. It's got to be grounded in reality.
Okay, so possible. What's the second P?
Plausible. Can this business actually attract customers? Can it generate revenue that'll last? You might have the best idea in the world, but if nobody wants it, well, are you really solving a problem? Or just a problem you invented because you like the solution?
Right. It's got to connect with people. And the final P.
This is the big one. Probable. Even if your idea is possible, And it seems plausible. Is it actually likely to succeed in the long run? This is where you factor in the competition, the regulations, how customers are changing, all of those external forces that can make or break you.
So it's about being brutally honest, really questioning everything, not just having a good sales pitch.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Damodaran says you use this 3P test throughout the life of the company, not just at the start.
Oh, that's interesting. So what might have seemed like a sure thing, maybe a few years down the line, it's not so certain anymore. Things change.
Exactly. The market changes, you change, the whole game changes. You've got it. And this is where it gets tricky, right? Because you think, okay, we found something that works. Now it's just about scaling up, doing more of the same.
Right, like if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah, but Damodaran, he points to companies like Apple, Microsoft, giants, right? But even they've had their growth struggles.
Interesting.
Keeping up that same pace of growth from when they were like a tenth of the size, it's not easy.
It's true. What worked when you were the scrappy upstart, it doesn't always translate when you're the big dog on the block.
Exactly. And a lot of it comes down to how well a company can, get the money it needs and then use it wisely. And that's where Damodaran gets into venture capital, IPOs, private equity, all that.
Okay, so it's not just about knowing the different ways to raise money, but like the whole game around it, right?
Yeah.
The different players and their motives at each stage.
Absolutely. He gets into their heads like venture capitalists. They're like poker players, comfortable going all in on a hand, even if it's risky, because the potential payout.
Oh, I see. So they're okay with some big losses because the wins can be huge.
Huge. They're looking for those 10x, 100x returns. That kind of risk tolerance, though, wouldn't fly once a company's gone public. Got to answer to shareholders then.
Yeah, different ballgame entirely.
Totally. And that's where understanding IPOs, it's crucial. Damodaran explains how that whole shift, going public, it changes everything. Expectations, regulations, scrutiny, everything's amplified.
And you've got a whole bunch of new investors too, right? Probably
Yeah.
some interesting psychology at play there as well.
Oh, absolutely. This is where Damodaran's insights into behavioral economics, they really shine. He says even the most, seasoned investors, they can get caught up in things like herd mentality,
Yeah, FOMO, fear of missing out.
Exactly. Everyone's piling into the next hot stock, not even really looking at the fundamentals.
It's tempting, though, when it seems like everyone else is getting rich quick.
It is. That's why Damodaran, he really emphasizes thinking for yourself, doing your own research, not just following the crowd.
So it's like navigating the world of finance. It's not just about the numbers. It's about understanding human nature.
100%. And that same principle, it applies to something else that's super important in the corporate world, and that's debt. Damodaran has a whole chapter on it, calls it The Allure and Illusion of Debt.
Okay, the title alone has me hooked. What's so alluring and what's the illusion?
Well, debt, it can seem like free money, especially when interest rates are low. It's tempting, right?
Yes.
Fuel your growth, expand, but the illusion is it's usually riskier than it seems.
Right, there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Exactly. Eventually, you got to pay the piper. Damodaran points out the right amount of debt for a company, it's not a fixed thing. It changes throughout its life.
Oh, interesting. So a young company, maybe they can handle more debt than someone more established, like with steady but slower growth.
Precisely. He uses examples like Airbnb back in the day versus, say, Kraft Heinz, who already had a lot of debt. His point is, too much debt, it can stifle innovation. You can't adapt as easily when things change. And worst case, it raises the risk of,
Bankruptcy.
Exactly. So it's all about finding the sweet spot, just like anything else in business.
Finding that balance. So where do dividends and stock buybacks fit into all of this? It's that classic dilemma, right? Do you reinvest your profits for future growth or give some back to the shareholders?
Right, tough question. And Damodaran, he says there's no one right answer, which is interesting. He gives examples of companies that made good and, well, not so good choices with those strategies. He even talks about this idea of dysfunctional dividends.
Dysfunctional dividends, that's a new one. What does that even mean?
Imagine a company, they're feeling the pressure to keep paying out these dividends to keep their investors happy, even if that money could be better used somewhere else, like research and development, or maybe a strategic acquisition.
Oh, I see. So they're sacrificing the long game for a short-term win.
Exactly. And he says those kinds of decisions, they often happen because people are thinking short-term, not really understanding the whole life cycle of a company.
Makes sense. So how do you decide then when is it the right time to pay dividends, buy back stock, or just reinvest those profits?
Valuation is key. Damodaran, he argues you got to understand a company's intrinsic value, what it's really worth, to make those big decisions about how to use its capital.
Okay, so let's talk valuation, I imagine, with like well-established companies. It's fairly straightforward. But what about these young companies, especially in those fast-changing industries?
Yeah.
How do you put a price on potential?
Now that is the million-dollar question. And Damodaran admits it's tricky, especially with those younger companies, but it's not impossible.
So no easy formulas then.
Not quite. He talks about the importance of factoring in uncertainty and optionality.
Okay, help me out here. What does that mean, uncertainty and optionality, when you're trying to value a young company?
Okay, think of it this way. A young company, it's like a ship setting sail, but they're heading into uncharted waters. There's so many ways it could go. Some amazing, some...
Some that end up shipwrecked.
Exactly. Uncertainty means acknowledging we can't predict the future. There are many possible outcomes.
Right, makes sense. And optionality.
That's about recognizing young companies, they can change course quickly, right? They can pivot, seize a new opportunity as it pops up. They've got flexibility.
So it's not just projecting their current performance, but trying to put a value on that potential, that adaptability. That's tough.
It is, and that's why Damodaran, he cautions against relying too much on those traditional metrics like price-to-earnings ratios with young companies.
Yeah.
Those are based on the past, and the past isn't always a good predictor of the future, especially in a fast-moving industry.
It's like trying to figure out where a rocket's going to land based on just the first few seconds of its launch. You need a different approach.
Absolutely. You need different tools, a different way of thinking to value potential, especially when it's all about innovation and disruption.
And speaking of disruption, Damodaran, he really gets into how all these new technologies, these new ways of doing business, how they're impacting the whole corporate life cycle, right?
He does, and he uses some really interesting case studies, like he breaks down the rise of Tesla.
Oh, Tesla. Now that's a company that seems to defy all the usual expectations and valuation methods.
Right, and Damodaran, he's honest about how complex it is to value a company like Tesla. It's not just a car company, it's tech, it's energy, it's even going this like cult of personality around it.
But you're not just valuing a business, you're valuing a whole movement.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so fascinating. Damodaran argues a lot of Tesla's value, it comes from its story, its potential to disrupt, just as much as its current financials.
It really highlights how, in today's world, those lines between industries, they're blurring, and the old ways of valuing companies, they might not cut it anymore.
Absolutely. And this all leads to another really important part of Damodaran's framework. How does disruption affect the companies that are already established, the more mature ones?
Right, because it's not just about understanding how to value the disruptors, but also those who are being disrupted.
Exactly. And this is where understanding those stages of the corporate life cycle, it's so key. Damodaran argues companies in the later stages, they can be really vulnerable to disruption if they're not careful.
It's easy to get complacent, right? When
Yeah.
you've been on top for so long, you might not see the changes happening until it's too late.
It's tough, right? You're almost asking them to completely change their DNA. But Damodaran, he says it takes a real shift in mindset, being willing to question everything, even accepting that maybe you're not invincible.
It's like embracing humility,
Yeah.
which isn't always easy in the business world.
Right. He calls it the serenity strategy.
Serenity strategy. Okay, now I'm really curious. What does that even look like, being serene, when you're in the middle of this cutthroat business environment?
It starts with recognizing that not every company is going to be around forever, you know? Just like people, companies go through these phases, they grow, they mature, and sometimes...
They decline.
Exactly. And Damodaran, he says, fighting that natural cycle, it often does more harm than good.
Interesting. You mean like refusing to admit that maybe you're past your prime? That can actually hurt you more.
Exactly. He says a lot of the worst decisions, bad mergers, clinging to outdated ideas, it comes from this desperation to defy the natural order of things.
So clinging to that fantasy of endless growth, it can backfire in a big way.
Big time. That's where the serenity comes in. It's about being honest about where your company is in its life cycle and then making smart choices, even if they're tough choices. It might mean downsizing, selling off parts of the business, even accepting a merger, if that's what makes sense.
So sometimes it's better to have a strategic retreat than go down swinging.
Exactly. And sometimes it's about being realistic, you know? Admitting when a company is, well, what Damodaran calls the walking dead.
Okay, that sounds ominous. What are the signs of a corporate zombie then? And is there any hope for a company at that point, or is it too late?
He points to a few things: huge debt, shrinking revenues, and leadership that's either in denial or, even worse, panicking. He says turnarounds are possible, but
But they're rare.
Very rare. And they need a level of honesty and decisive action that's often missing.
Hmm.
It's hard for leaders to admit the strategies that got them there, they don't work anymore.
Yeah, it's like that's got to be a tough pill to swallow.
It is, and that's why Damodaran, he talks about how important it is to have a strong board of directors, people who can be objective, challenge the CEO.
So having those hard conversations early on, even when it's uncomfortable, that's crucial.
Crucial, and that's also where this idea of sum of the parts valuation comes in. Sometimes, Damodaran says, breaking up a company, selling off the valuable pieces, it's actually better for shareholders than trying to keep this dying thing alive.
It's like admitting that the parts are worth more than the whole now.
Exactly. It might feel like a failure, but sometimes it's the smartest move.
So this serenity strategy, it's about adapting, making tough choices, knowing when to hold on and when to let go.
Exactly. And Damodaran reminds us this applies to our own lives, too, our careers, our investments.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in chasing success, always wanting more, that we forget to ask if we're even on a sustainable path.
Right. He says growing old is mandatory, but growing up is optional.
I like that. A lot to think about there. Well, that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into Aswath Damodaran's NW, the corporate life cycle. We've covered a ton, but hopefully you've got some new insights into how businesses work, how the markets work, maybe even how we work as humans. Thanks for joining us.